talking about cleaning and classifying content and migrating files on a big scale. A lot of our projects we work with large companies, and they have a lot of content to move around. So we're going to be taking a step back and looking at things, through that kind of a lens today. My name's Mark Rye. I'm VP of Sales and Marketing here with Perram Corporation. We're scheduled for 30 minutes to run through the session. Feel free to enter any questions you may have into the go-to meeting sidebar. That's probably on the right side of your screen. And I'll pop back in from time to time and address those. Other than that, we'll get going. All right, so first off, I think it's worth just stepping back and realizing that we have a bit of a problem here around migration. Most organizations do. When we're talking about unstructured content, content has built up in a lot of different repositories, and very large amounts of content have built up. And rarely is the content all where we want it to be. Is it organized the way that we want it to be? Is it retrievable? And it's really hard for a lot of organizations to get their head around that in terms of how do we move forward. So we'll be talking about some steps in terms of how to move forward and how to gauge where you sit in that process as we go through the presentation today. So for most of the organizations we work with, the current state of enterprise content management looks something like this. We have a set of documents or a repository of documents in the ECM system. Commonly, those documents have little to no records management being applied to them. Little to no metadata that makes it useful for being able to locate those documents. So within the ECM system itself, we find that there's this potential retrofitting that's required so that we can go in, clean up what's there, attribute it properly, and apply records classification. That's actually a topic for a whole nother day. I'm not going to get into that too much, but it is an interesting topic that maybe we'll come back to. Luckily, though, for most organizations, and I say luckily kind of in a cheeky way, most of the content is actually outside of your enterprise content management system still. And it's sitting in SharePoint and shared drive. And that content certainly needs cleanup, the same sort of classification and attribution to be able to make sense of it in terms of the enterprise content management system. If we dive in a little deeper and start to answer the questions, okay, how big is big? We work with a lot of Fortune 500 companies where big is pretty big. Not uncommon to see 50 million files on a shared drive or a series of file shares or more, or many times more, but certainly 50 million. SharePoint's a bit of a wild card here. Some organizations got on board early with SharePoint, and it went wild, and they may have 50 or 100 million files on SharePoint. Other organizations contained it or brought it in much later, so that they may only have 5 or 10 million files. But more of a consistency is where the number of files in enterprise content management fit compared to shared drive. Those are kind of the two more steady or consistent parts of the puzzle. And we've been tracking this for a couple of years with the folks that we speak with about how much of their content is in their ECM system compared to shared drives or outside of it. And that has come in around 16%, right around 16% of content for organizations that have an enterprise content management system is sitting in their ECM system. The rest is in shared drives and potentially some other places. So whether you are a Fortune 500 company with hundreds of millions of files or potentially smaller, some of these ratios may make sense to you still. But this is kind of as it averages out what people are up against. if we dive into that content a little deeper and look at it from a different point of view, we start to see what organizations are really concerned about and what motivates them to think about migration. So rarely do we see an organization that simply comes forward and says, we have 100 million files, this is ridiculous, we need to deal with this. 100 million files is just the cost of doing business, right? But there are some things that are held within those file repositories that can cause an organization to act and want to make changes. And typically what that means is we dive into, let's say there are those 50 million files on a shared drive or SharePoint site. Out of that, there may be something happening within the organization that says, okay, we know that we have some percentage of those, let's say 10 million files, which are important to us. The rest, we really could care less right now about processing, but these 10 million we've identified as being important. And then what typically happens from a project point of view is beyond that, we'll kind of subdivide things down and say, okay, now we've identified within that general category of documents a more specific subset that we want to take a look at. And we're beginning to identify specific business units that have that kind of content. So again, rarely do clients come forth and just want to address the whole repository as a project, and that certainly doesn't even make sense as a project. We always need to chop things up and do it more systematically than that. But usually the business driver, if it has some real top-down support for the project, is much more around some specific issue that we're having within the organization with a specific subset of this data. What are those important documents? Well, obviously it depends on the type of business you do and what's going on in your business as to what those are. Sometimes an organization will come forward and they'll say, we need to deal with the legal department. You know, everything in there is high value to us, and we just want to make sure we're doing it right. And that department will then become the focus of a cleanup, classification, content rationalization, and migration exercise. Other times it'll be less departmentally driven and more based on the actual record type or the content that we're interested in. So things like all of the, I'm using XYZ records here, either across a department or across the entire company, may become of interest for some reason. In some examples, maybe it's information regarding a specific asset. So it may be a part of the business that's being sold off, and we need to get our hands around all of that content so that we know what to do with it. Maybe we need to secure it. Maybe we need to pass it off to the buyer. Or it may be all the information around a particular product or product line that has all of a sudden had some light shone on it, and we realize we need to get our hands around that. Or it could just be a general subject matter that is bubbling up based on compliance or other issues that's saying, okay, we need to figure out what this is. So when we start to think about how does the concern of the organization relate to a project, we can see that it can take on a couple of different forms. So it may be, again, it may be that example where we're going to go into the legal department, work with all of the business units and the business areas within there, pick them up and essentially move them from, let's say, SharePoint sites and shared drives into the ECM system because it's a part of a strategic move, department by department. Or it may look something more like this, where we're really interested in documents of a certain type, a certain subject matter, and that may be mixed within a particular department or across the entire company. So then, as opposed to knowing exactly what we're dealing with from an organizational point of view. We're not just picking up this department. What we need to do is identify what business units work with content or own content of a certain type. And then from there begin to put a plan together in terms of how are we going to move individual business units, the content that exists within those to ECM, how are we going to do that through entire departments and then across the organization. So understanding what the motivation is helps us put a plan together in terms of how the migration activity impacts the organization, who we're going to need involved, and how deep we're going to be getting into content within these different business areas. Now, having said that, when we're coming at things from a purely strategic point of view, the migration can lose some steam because we've identified some high-value documents. And if the only goal is to move those into the ECM system, then we're not really taking advantage of so many other benefits that can be achieved through the migration. So one of the things that we suggest is at this time of momentum, while there has been some very important strategic documents identified that we want to get our hands around and understand where they are and how we can manage them better, is that we put together a program that will really help extend that so that we can extend the migration beyond just that subject matter and actually roll through the organization having a real impact. In order for that to be successful, what we really need to do is pull together different folks into a working committee. So representatives from information governance or records management, depending on the terminology in your organization, from IT, from the business. Certainly we need some executive support as well to recognize the broader benefits of doing what we're starting with. Because again, most of this starts with some sort of trigger event, right? Organizations know that it's the right thing to do to clean up their content, get it all in the system that they purchased originally to manage it effectively, delete it when it's no longer of value. I mean, we know that we should be doing that. But typically, there's a trigger event which leads to the funding, right? So while that trigger event has led to the funding, we want to see if there's an opportunity to expand the vision a little bit and then continue on. So in order to do that, we need to leverage this initial work that we're doing and do some benchmarking on the improvements that we're seeing in some certain areas. And that's certainly around productivity, our ability to access information in a timely manner, which is an interesting one because documentation that we can't put our hands on quickly and then present to the required individuals can really cause a problem, right? And then just our storage bloat is certainly a good thing to always track because I think most organizations would really be amazed at how much money they're spending. Storage is cheap, right? We've all heard that. But if we start to poke holes in that, look at the numbers and look at the amount of rot that exists within our repositories, there are real savings to be had there. So what we're doing is we're really talking about changing the way that the business is going to create, store, and retrieve content so that we can pick up whoever is in that initial scope that's based on that trigger event, pick up and fully transition them to ECM, at least for that subject matter, if it's subject matter driven. And then shut down the use of the shared drives and SharePoint sites to the extent that we can. If it's subject matter based, that can be tricky, unless the SharePoint sites were subject matter based. Shared drives, shutting them down is tricky without doing a full transition, right? So if it's a departmental move, absolutely we need to do that. That, again, though, is trickier if it's a partial move based on subject matter. But whenever possible, we want to be seeing a transition forward as opposed to just another option in terms of where we want to store content. I'm going to take a quick break here, just take a look at the questions. I don't see anything in there as of yet. If you do, again, feel free to enter it into the questions panel, and I'll pop back at the end of the presentation and just see if there's anything that needs to be addressed. Let's move on to the second part of our presentation. So in order to begin addressing migration and preparing the organization for what it can do for you, we can really think about working at the following levels. One at the program level, the business level, the systems level, and then at the level of the content itself. And I want to work through these and just talk about them briefly to bring you on board with what I'm thinking. So at the program level, we mentioned earlier, we really need representation from IG and RM. They're of course going to be pivotal in any kind of project like this if we're going to get all of the benefit we want out of it. IT needs to be involved, legal if that's a separate entity from IG and RM, and then we need executive support. And we really need to be looking at this like it's not a little project. I think that's really hurt the efforts over the years of trying to move unstructured content, is we liken it to a migration of a structured database to another structured database, and we don't realize that with any unstructured migration comes inevitably, should come, change in information structure and change in the retrievability or access to the information. So appreciating that and recognizing it's not a little project, it's a big project. In fact, it may be a huge project because it may impact the way every single user, information worker in your company accesses content. And it can have some real ROI around our ability to access that content in a timely manner, be productive the way we're working, and our ability to prove compliance with any regulation that we are up against and responsible for complying with. So framing the project or the program in that way really allows us to get away from some of the old stigmas that we're just going to move some content around, and that this really is a serious project. Once we've done that, we can go to the business level and start to see the impact there. So with that program level support coming down from the top, coming from legal, IGRM, IT, we can begin to analyze the business for the subject matter we're interested in and see who will be impacted by the potential migration that we're thinking about, and then begin to engage, right? So we want to educate those business areas on why we're doing what we're doing, what are the benefits to the organization, and what are the benefits to the business. And we better have some benefits to the business if we're going to be doing this. And we want to really engage them in this entire process because it is so impactful at the user level. We really need to engage them in the design of the information structure and how they will navigate the content moving forward in the new system so that they can take ownership of it and it's not something pushed down. If it's pushed down to them, then they can push back. If it's something that they were involved with and have some ownership over, then they can really embrace it and move forward. Once we've engaged with the business, we really need to take a hard look at the systems. So what systems are involved? Are we talking about SharePoint, shared drives, ECM? Where are we going? How's content moving from one to the other? In the target system, the one that we're going to be sticking with going forward, is that system configured optimally? And optimally currently, is the business able to use the defined content? Are we managing records? Do we know how to delete files? in accordance with the retention schedule. Whenever we're moving content into a system, we should be thinking, we shouldn't be doing so unless we know how we're going to delete it. Because then we're just getting into another retrofit, right, of that content. We're going to have to process it again. And the ability, again, to retrieve content. This is huge at the system level. So that means the information structure, any content management system has a couple of levels, right? There's the shell or the technology, and then there's the configuration of the technology to form the information structure, which allows us to interact with the content. And it's the configuration of that information structure which has the biggest impact on the users and the usability. By far the most common complaint that we hear from organizations that come to us, they say, we have put some stuff in the ECM system, but our users keep saying, or in SharePoint, right, if SharePoint is your target ECM, but our users say search is no good. I can't find anything. Well, we need to think about that, because that's not a product of the system. It's not a problem with the search capabilities. It's a problem with the information structure within the system and the way we process, tag, and classify the content. And when we appreciate that, and we appreciate how the users want to retrieve content, then we have a chance of being able to configure, tag, classify things in a way that will support that retrieval. The other thing we want to think about from a system level is, what do we want to shut down? So I hear a lot that I can't put more content in there unless I'm shutting something down, right? I can't validate a migration activity if there's no system being shut down. I mean, why bother? The whole point of moving from one to another is to get a savings in terms of systems, right? So that might be decommissioning your shared drive. It might be decommissioning old SharePoint sites. But we want to take a hard look at that and make sure we have a plan so that we see what's being shut down when and what are the potential savings to the organization by doing that. And then from a content level, we want to get into the content and understand what we have. So realize that up to 80% of your content may be redundant, outdated, and trivial and should be deleted. In a manner that's in compliance with your policies, of course, but commonly we say 40 to 50%. Again, in the industry, we see 75 to 80% being kind of that upper range. But even if you went just down to half and said half of our files should be deleted, that's probably a realistic number, a very realistic number for most organizations. The other thing we want to do at a content level is look at how are we organizing content moving forward. So if we're going to SharePoint or an ECM system, are we using folders? If so, how does the metadata interact with the folders? If we're not using folders, how is metadata only going to lead to an effective retrieval system? And if we're going metadata only, how are we going to test the retrievability of files before we input them, before we migrate? Because if not, if we're just guessing at the metadata, putting it in the system and hoping that users can retrieve things, well, you're probably guessing what the answer is. They're not going to be able to, and that's what leads to that number one complaint is I can't find anything, right? So we need to design the information structure regardless of how folders and metadata are being used in a way that allows us to ensure retrievability by the business. And I'm not going into a detailed on any of this right now. I'd be glad to. We'd be glad to. We have tons of expertise on all of this. Just trying to give a high level of what these big projects are concerned with and what you might want to be thinking about. So how do we start to do some of this? So Perram's been providing services in this area for 14 years now. We've really developed an approach that allows us to bring a mix of people expertise, so around classification, information structure, systems, and program level, combined with a process, a proven, defined process to move a business unit through a migration project, combined with a technology suite which supports all of the processing required. And we've married all of these things together. So we certainly don't feel like it's not one problem that you need to solve with these sorts of projects. It's certainly not even one piece of technology in most cases. There's a lot going on. When we look at that a little deeper, specifically what we're bringing to the table on the technology front, things like deduping, indexing, categorization, or auto-classification, disposition processing, file mapping, and it goes on from there, renaming files, validation from a user perspective in terms of use and retrievability, pre-migration, and then obviously the migration component of it as well. We bring all of that to the table. We bring understanding of information governance and how to interpret your policies and then guide your stakeholders through that. Because if we're going to identify 1 million files that need to be deleted or 10 million files maybe that need to be deleted, pretty sure nobody's ever signed off on that in your organization. Maybe they have, but for most organizations, they haven't. So there needs to be some facilitation around that quite often. Again, we bring that process to help us interact with the business because this really is a project that impacts the business, and we need to be able to bring them into discussions on folder structures, metadata models, and how their files are being tagged and attributed and classified. And then change management tools are required because at one point we're going to hit the button, files are going to move, and most of the users in that business area that was impacted by that move aren't going to be aware completely of what was going on, right? So we need to be able to show them through some tools what that project was all about and how to find their content moving forward. From a technology point of view, we've streamlined things so that while our software does a lot, you don't need to learn the whole software package. You can just let us do the heavy lifting, and you can just use the Perrallel Classify, the Perrallel portal to really view into what we're doing. The client viewer, you see the whole classification environment. You can make decisions. You can test drive things, but you don't need to learn how to use auto classification tools, for example. I'm going to wrap up here quickly. A couple of slides left. Project personnel. With these large projects, obviously we're talking at the program level. There's representation. Then we need a specific project lead for the individual business, for the project work, and then validators from the individual business areas involved. And that may be 1 or 2 people depending on the amount of content. Those validators are going to help us ensure that the information structure being put forth to the new system makes sense, and the file mapping and tagging makes sense as well. The remainder of the users within that business area are just impacted then when we actually do change and they're impacted or they begin using our change management tools. On a slide, a project looks like this. We're running about 2 months per migration activity. We may have 5, 10, 20 activities going on at a time. So we consolidate these to a level of the business area so that users aren't looking at content that's outside of the scope of their business area. It just makes more sense to segment things quite distinctly when we're doing these kinds of migrations. And then in the 2-month process, we're going to walk through an analysis of the current state. We're going to build out that information structure or modify it if there's an existing one. We're going to run the classification and attribution work. We're going to allow the representatives from that business area that we're talking about to validate all of this, so test drive what's this new information structure, how are the files being mapped into it, pre-migration, get some feedback, make sure they're happy. We go forward with the migration into the new system, and then again, the change management tools that Perram provides flip over and allow everybody to follow what happened so that they have a bridge from the old to the new. In a nutshell, let's see. I think we're coming up to time. I'm going to come back into questions. That's basically the information I wanted to cover today. These large projects happen in small chunks. Usually they're driven. Again, everybody knows they need to do it, right? But usually there's a trigger event. So the key is understanding the trigger event, what it means in terms of scope, and then seeing what you can do as an organization to leverage the trigger event to expand that scope post-completion of the first project or the initial scope of the project. I'm going to pop in, see if there's any questions that are trickling in about that conversation and the approach. All right, I don't see anything coming in right now, so I'm going to thank everyone for their time. I think the recording or the presentation has been recorded. I'll double check, and if so, we'll be able to make it available. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. As I said, we can dive deeper into any of the areas that we touched on today, but wanted to give an overview of what these larger projects look like. Oh, I do have a question that just popped in, and it's a good one. It says, is a 2-month project realistic? And so what I have on the screen here is a 2-month project. Yes, indeed, we do it all the time. But remember, that's 2 months for a particular business area. So that business area may have 50 people, 100 people. It may have 1 million files, may have 500,000 files, whatever the case may be. And then we'll probably have 5, 10, 20 of those individual projects going on. So they could all be running at the same time, or they may run at each on their own schedule, right? So the broader program may run for a year, may run for 2 years, just depending on how these business areas come in and out. But within the scope of a particular project for a business area, yeah, the process on the screen is around 2 months. It looks like there was potentially a follow-on there. Yeah, and it says, okay, that's what I thought. How long to full corporation of 4,300 employees? Yeah, so 4,300 employees, what we really want to do is take a look at the org chart and break out those projects and see how we want to transition them. So I think within a 12-month period, you could certainly be successful. You might want to extend it out because there are other activities that are happening at the program level beyond specifically what we're doing, right? So there's a lot of communication and change management that the organization would want to be doing to both line up the business units so that they're aware of what's going on, and then training on the technologies that they're moving to, things like that. So certainly building out a project for an organization over the course of a year, 18 months, where we're doing a number of individual migrations over that time frame makes sense. So that'll kind of give you a ballpark, I think. And again, we'd be glad to discuss specifics and get into a more detailed response. All right, so I think that's what we have. I saw a recommendation or a request to have the information sent out, and yes, again, we will do that. So, all right, I'm going to, unless there's anything else that pops in, I'm going to say thank you for everyone's time. I appreciate it. We're glad to continue the discussion. If it's something of interest, just let us know, and we'll follow up with the information from today's session in probably this afternoon or in the next day. Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.